Okay, so I'm going to show you how to mix plaster. When you look at the plaster instructions on the bag, they're going to give you a ratio of plaster to water. But the way I'm going to show you is much more foolproof, because the ratio of plaster to water, plaster is very affected by ambient humidity. Ambient moisture means moisture or water or wetness in the air around, right? That's what ambient means, around you, right? So the wetter a day it is, the less water you're going to have to add, because the plaster will be getting moisture from the air. So the proportions on the bag, although will be generally fine, won't be as exactly right as what I'm going to show you today. So let's move over to, so I've got a few things on the table here that are generally useful when you're casting plaster. We're not going to use these particular things today, but I just wanted to show you can use some flashing to make a shape with that you can cast into. You can use these clips that are available at the sculpture studio to hold it closed, and then that could be your shape that you cast into. You can use pieces of wood to create a shape to cast into. You can use a pre-existing container. If you wanted roughly this shape, you could use this container. If you wanted this shape, you could use this container. And then, depending on what you're casting into, if it's something real slick and smooth, you don't need to use any kind of a release agent. So release agent means something that will make it release or come off or come out of the container. So plaster will pop pretty nicely out of anything that's real smooth and clean inside, but if you're working with wood or something else that might have a little more of a texture to it, Murphy's oil soap makes a great release. You can also use any kind of cooking oil. You can use Pam cooking spray. You can use some oil in your cabinet that's gotten a little old and isn't really great to eat anymore. You can use Vaseline. That makes a wonderful barrier. If you do use Vaseline, the plaster will pick up a little bit of the texture of the Vaseline, but if you don't care for whatever reason, you can use Vaseline. Anything that will create a nice slick barrier, kind of like when you're baking and you put oil on the tray before you bake something, or butter before cookies. You can tell I'm not really a baker. This helps it release from whatever you're casting into. But if it's real smooth inside, you don't need a release agent. So for today, I'm gonna make myself a plaster bat. So I'm just making myself a smooth, round disc of plaster that I'm gonna use to recondition clay with. So I'm going to use pottery plaster, which is right here. The difference between pottery plaster and plaster from the hardware store is just the consistency of the plaster. You're guaranteed a certain result with the pottery plaster, and the plaster from the hardware store is a little less predictable. For most sculpture needs, actually regular plaster is just fine, but when you're dealing with ceramics and making molds that you're going to slip cast out of, etc., then it's really important to use pottery plaster. Pottery plaster is a little more expensive. So I'm using pottery plaster, and here I have a trug with a nice clean, smooth inner surface, so I did not have to apply any release agent. And I'm actually just going to mix the plaster in the trug, and then instead of pouring it into a different container, I'm just going to let it set up in this container and then pop it out when it's done, and I'll have my nice, smooth, round plaster disc. So maybe get a shot into the container. So you can see I have water in here, about the amount of plaster that I want to end up with, maybe just a little bit less. And now I'm just going to start adding plaster. Plaster will not hurt your hands. The only dangerous thing about plaster, it won't hurt you if you got any in your mouth, it'll just go right through. The dangerous thing is breathing the dust. So we're working outside, so we're pretty safe to work outside, but I still want to avoid really making it super cloudy and breathing it in. If you're gonna mix plaster indoors, please wear a mask, a dust mask. We all have plenty of masks these days. So I'm just gonna take my plaster, one handful at a time, and drop it into the water. And as I drop it in, I'm gonna go like this with my hands and make sure it drops in smoothly and evenly. And I keep going until I get to the right consistency. And how I can tell when I'm close is that the plaster will start to form little islands on the surface of the water. It's hard to describe, but it'll be really obvious when it happens. So I just keep putting in. I'm doing big handfuls right now because I know that I'm still pretty far away. And I'm watching how long does it take to sink. So when you first start putting it in, the plaster is just going to sink right away. It just goes straight down into the water. And then as the water starts to become more saturated, it'll take a little longer and a little longer to melt down. And then eventually it'll start to sit on the surface and create little islands. And that's when we know we're close. And then I'll explain exactly how much when we get there. So while I'm putting this in, we'll also talk a little bit about plaster. So plaster can be used to make a mold to cast other things out of, or it can be your final material. You can even make a plaster mold and then pour plaster into the mold to make a plaster sculpture, right? So you could make a sculpture out of clay, and then you could make a plaster mold around that sculpture, and then pour plaster into the plaster mold to make a plaster cast. And if you do it right, you can actually make multiple plaster casts out of your one plaster mold. One of the ways that when I say do it right is you can't have undercuts. And what that means is that you can't have any areas, because the plaster will cure up hard, so you can't have any areas that would catch in the mold. This is just extra info. You don't need it for this, but just while I'm doing this. The other thing I could mention about plaster is that plaster does not dry like clay. Well, it does also dry, but it gets hard by curing, not drying. C-U-R-E, cure. So what I mean by that is a chemical reaction takes place between the plaster and the water that makes the plaster harden up. So it's not drying, it's just curing. Then once it's cured and hard, it will also continue to dry. The moisture will start to leave the plaster, and that takes a lot longer. But it doesn't take all that long to cure. Okay, so if you look at the plaster now, watch when I put in the next handful, it's not sinking down immediately. See that? It's kind of sitting on the surface just a little bit. So then I know that I'm getting a little closer. It's not forming islands yet, but it is just sitting on the surface. Just see that, how it kind of pauses on the surface? So I'm going to keep going until that pause turns into actually islands that don't go down. So I keep spreading it out. I don't want to just dump it in. I want to spread it as I do it because I'm trying to suspend the plaster into the water and get the right saturation. So today's a pretty moist day, and this bag of plaster was not new. And that's why when I use this technique, instead of just a straight proportion from the bag, I know that I'm getting the right amount of plaster to water no matter the conditions. And the reason that matters is that if your plaster and water proportion, oh, see how it's really sitting on the surface now? But it's still going down pretty quickly. I want it to stay on the surface for a good few seconds in a few different spots, and then I'll know that I've got the right amount. So I'm putting a little less at a time now and pausing in between to see how much it's sinking. So the reason it matters to get your plaster to water proportion right is that will determine the strength of your plaster. So if you have too much water or too much plaster, it may not cure properly and it may be weak. So you really want to get your proportion right. So, oh, look, that island is not sinking now. You see that? And let's see if I give it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to do just a little bit more because I feel like it's all kind of in the middle. Do a little around the edges and a little more around the edges, but I'm just about there. Okay, so this is what I want. I want islands of plaster that take a while to sink. Take a good 5 to 10 seconds to sink. This is the right amount of plaster. So now I'm ready to mix it. So I'm just going to mix it with my hand. And the other way that I know that I mixed the right amount of plaster to water is that when I pull my hand out of this mix, the plaster is going to coat my hand in a way that you can't really see my skin color through easily. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm sort of squeezing with my hand and finding any lumps and squeezing them out. You don't have to do this with your hand. You could use a tool. I like doing it with my hand. I feel like I can really find the lumps. I know that I'm mixing it right. The only thing that it'll do to your skin is it's kind of drying, just like clay. So after I'm done, I'll wipe it off with a paper towel and then I'll wash my hands. Oh, that's another really important aspect of plaster. Because it's curing and not drying to get hard, it will cure right in your plumbing. And you'll have hard, solid pieces of plaster in your plumbing. So never, never, never put plaster down the drain. You want to get as much of it as possible into the garbage, wipe it out with a paper towel, wipe out your containers, wipe off your hands, throw it into the garbage, and only rinse in the sink once you've gotten like 95% of the plaster off and out before you go to the sink. Because a little tiny bit will just get washed down, but if you get any significant amounts of plaster in there, it's forever. It'll harden inside your drain. because remember, it's curing, not drying. Okay, so now I'm going to show you, now it's all mixed up, I'm going to show you how it coats my hand. So see that? See how you don't, it's like thick on my hand. If the plaster was too thin, you would really see my skin color through, but you can see how this is nice and thick over my hand. Okay, so now I can do two things. I can just leave this to cure in this container, or I could have just, maybe I just use this to mix it up, and then I can pour it into whatever container I want. So let's pour it into this one. So this could be a mold that I'm casting into, or whatever I want to make in plaster, or I could just want this little shape. So I'm going to pour some of this plaster into this one. And I'm going to leave the rest in this one. And this is going to become my big flat disc that I want for ceramics. Okay, great. So that's mixing plaster. Stop.